Thank you all very much. Thank you. I appreciate it. Appreciate you being here. I know some of you drove quite a ways to be here today. It looks like a pretty good turnout, and so I'm happy for that. I want to say thanks to Sherry Hamill, thanks to the Alabama Department of Archives and History for having me here. This is a fantastic program. I'm actually honored and frankly pretty humbled to be a part of it when you look back at the list of some of the people who have given these talks, people that I really admire and respect. Wayne Flint, Dan Carter, Catherine Braund, who some of you may be familiar with. It's a pretty humbling thing for me to stand here and be a part of this, so I'm appreciative of that. Here to talk about the Levy-Macon case, which most of you are probably at least familiar with. Many of you, I know, in fact, have a very personal stake in this. I've experienced that case, the events particularly surrounding the origins of this case in Tuskegee and Macon County. And so I'm very, very mindful of that. I do want to discuss those events. You cannot discuss this case, obviously, without discussing those events. But what I really want to do today is to contextualize the case as far as it pertains to Tuskegee and Macon County. So as the title would suggest, what I want to talk about today is the sort of crux of the talk today is how this becomes a statewide case. Because I think most of you that do know the case know that it's not just the case that desegregates Macon County schools, it's the case that ultimately desegregates 99 school districts throughout the state of Alabama. It's a very long-running case, a case that is administered by the courts and the Justice Department and the plaintiffs' attorneys, and of course local school boards and superintendents throughout the state for decades. And there are still splinter cases from this case that are open even today. So that's kind of what I want to do here, again, as the title will suggest, to sort of contextualize this as a statewide case. And I've probably bitten off a lot more than I can chew in the 45 minutes here, and that's maybe okay. So I'll try not to race through this as to try to get done, but there is a lot that I want to talk about. Anybody that's seen my dissertation knows that I have a hard time cutting things out. This image is the original 12 students. Originally it was 13 and cut down to 12 at one point. Who were what they called at the time the test cases, the students who elected to transfer from all-black Tuskegee Institute High to all-white Tuskegee Public there in Macon County. But I want to talk first about the earliest efforts to desegregate schools in Alabama. And I want to take it back to at least Brown, because right after the Brown v. Board decision in 1954, there were efforts, obviously unsuccessful efforts, but there were efforts to desegregate schools at that point. And it begins with the NAACP, the regional NAACP, and this woman here, Ruby Hurley, who is the director of the Southeast Regional Office, they tried to organize an implementation campaign they called Operation Implementation. And it was organized at the regional level, but carried out, as you might imagine, at the local level by local chapters of the NAACP. They tried to gather up signatures for petitions, essentially. They would gather up a number of parents, as many as they could. They would sign a petition. They would present that petition to the local school board and say, by the way, have you heard about the Brown v. Board decision? Could you present us with a plan for desegregation? And it was sort of an eye towards litigation all the way, and that was kind of the way Brown had been set up by the Supreme Court to, as one legal scholar put it, to sort of soften the blow that there would be individual cases in all of these districts throughout the South. And predictably, though, these petitions were roundly either rejected or actually in most cases ignored. There were a couple of dozen of these petitions that the NAACP sent out 1954, 1955. But more so than that official reaction, well, insofar as a rejection or an ignoral is an official reaction, more sinister and telling than that was the reaction of economic reprisal. And just to give you an example, in Selma in Dallas County, there are 29 signatories to that petition, and that petition was published. Someone at the Board of Education gives that petition to the local newspaper, and it's then published. And then 16 of those 29 people were then victimized by way of economic reprisal, whether that was being fired from a job, being denied credit, having their debts called in, and so on and so forth. And this was the work of the newly organized White Citizens Council. White Citizens Councils were cropping up in Alabama as early as late 1954. This is an organization that originates in Jackson, Mississippi, and then spreads very quickly into Alabama, first in the Black Belt, but then eventually all over the state, such that by 1956, there were 26 chapters in 17 counties with about 40,000 members. This has been described as a sort of more respectable version of the Ku Klux Klan insofar as they had the same goal, which was the maintenance of segregation and white supremacy. But they sought solutions, as they would have described it, sort of within the realm of law and order. And so they jettisoned the old violent tactics of the Klan, which were self-defeating, and they adopted this new method of economic reprisal, and this was a favored tactic. And so the work that you saw at Selma that I mentioned was very much exactly what the Citizens Council was counseling. Now, many leaders of the Citizens Council, including Sam Engelhardt of Macon County, but also people like Walter Given of Dallas County, were simultaneously leaders in the state legislature. And so what you saw along with economic reprisal was a massive sort of legislative barrage to try to shore up segregation, particularly in the realm of education. And these men, along with not just black belt leaders like Given and Engelhardt, but along with leaders from Birmingham like Albert Boutwell, begin to pass, again, this flurry of legislation, none more important than what they call a pupil placement law. That replaces the old compulsory segregation language in the Constitution. The 1901 Constitution of Alabama initially had a provision in there that says very explicitly there will be separate schools for blacks and whites, and they removed that and they put in all these other laws, particularly this placement law, which says you can place students in particular schools for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on down the line reasons, and on its face it's racially neutral, but it's very carefully crafted to shore up segregated education. For example, one of the provisions would be, well, if a particular placement would tend to create a breach of the peace or any sort of violent reaction, then you can refuse that student of that placement. And so it's giving school boards all the tools that they would possibly need to maintain segregated education. And the point here is that it made for a much more difficult target in court. So they're preparing for this sort of legislative battle that they know is coming. So the arch segregationist bloc that kind of comes to power in the late 50s in Alabama politically understands that the NAACP is public enemy number one for their purposes, and so they go after the NAACP. John Patterson, who becomes famous or infamous for his reaction to the Freedom Riders in 1961, and is sort of famous before that for kind of going after the Folsom administration and corruption and organized crime. I believe his first and most passionate goal when he first comes to office, and particularly when he's Attorney General before that, is to crush the NAACP, and he was very nearly successful in that. Using white supremacist judges in the state court system, namely Judge Walter Jones, the two of them go after the NAACP. They charge them with failing to register as a foreign corporation in the state of Alabama, which ironically is an old statute that was used in Louisiana against the Ku Klux Klan. But they used this against the NAACP, and Judge Jones hits them with this massive fine, $100,000 fine, which they had no hope of being able to pay. And it essentially handcuffs the NAACP in the state of Alabama for years. That has to get litigated through the state courts, removed to the federal courts, and it's up to the Supreme Court, I think, 2 or 3 times before the NAACP is able to function in the state again. So with the NAACP banned from operation in the state, the sort of banner for school desegregation falls then to the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth in Birmingham, who creates at that time the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. And in addition to a very nearly suicidal attempt to actually physically enroll his children at Phillips High School in Birmingham, Shuttlesworth files the state's first school desegregation lawsuit, and it's styled Shuttlesworth versus Birmingham Board of Education. It was aimed at that pupil placement law. It was aimed directly at that law, and it goes before, anytime you challenge the constitutionality of a state statute in federal court, a 3-judge court is convened. It doesn't just go before a single judge, and that 3-judge court actually upholds the law. There's an interesting wrinkle there. They uphold it and they say, well, on its face, it's constitutional. And so they leave the window open by saying, well, if it's applied in such a way as to perpetuate segregation, then it might be deemed unconstitutional in the future. So it gave a little bit of hope. And Shuttlesworth then files another suit, this one to be styled Armstrong versus Board of Education, against the school board there. But unfortunately for Shuttlesworth, that landed on the docket of Judge Seaborn Lynn, who was trending towards the segregationist side of the federal judiciary in the South. And so it languished there. Lynn was content to let that case sit there for several years. So by the time that the Fifth Circuit, the appellate court, forces Judge Lynn to then adjudicate that case, circa 1962 into 63, 6 other suits had been filed. And for those that do know Levy-Macon becomes a statewide case, I think we forget, certainly anybody from Mobile or Birmingham wouldn't forget that in Huntsville, there are other cases too. And there were 6 by that time. There was another one in Birmingham, Nelson. There was Hereford versus Huntsville, Davis versus Mobile, and there actually, what really gets lost, there were 3 suits filed by the Justice Department. They call them impacted areas suits that were filed on behalf of federal personnel at places like Redstone Arsenal. And those eventually come to naught, but those other cases are quite important, though they're not what we're here to talk about today. So, speaking of that, what about the origins then and early adjudication of the Levy-Macon case? Well, Fred Gray, the now famous activist attorney, Fred Gray, files in January of 1963 this initial complaint in Levy-Macon, seeking a permanent injunction against the Macon County School Board on behalf of 16 school children and their parents. And he had been urged to do this, in fact, by Detroit Lee years before. And Detroit Lee was active in the Tuskegee Civic Association, the TCA, and the NAACP, and he had been sort of pleading that they file this case. And at the time, they were more concerned, as many of you may know, with voting rights, the Gamillion v. Lightfoot case. And Fred Gray sort of makes him a promise and says, if you will hold off, if we can wait, then I promise you I'll make your kids lead plaintiffs when we do file this complaint. And that's, in fact, what happens in early 1963. Detroit Lee was a clerk at the local VA hospital. His son was an ambitious, as many of all of these students who became, as they call them, test cases in these school segregation cases, an ambitious rising senior with the courage to be prepared for not just sacrifice, but ridicule and ostracization. This complaint, though, lands on the docket of Judge Frank Johnson, whom probably all of you are familiar with. That gave it the best chance of any of the school cases filed in the state of a fair and efficient adjudication. Johnson was more than sympathetic to this legal struggle to secure constitutional rights. He was really firmly committed to it. And you began to see that perhaps with his being a part of the majority in the Browder v. Gale case, which invalidated this city's bus segregation laws, and you certainly begin to see it here. So that summer of 1963, while the other cases in the state, the Birmingham case, the Huntsville case, the Mobile case, while plaintiffs' efforts were being frustrated in those cases by Judge Lynn, by Judge Hobart Grooms, by Judge Daniel Mobile, those plaintiffs' efforts are initially frustrated, but then the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, when they get appealed, the circuit court is sending those back down and saying, no, you have to desegregate. Well, those appeals weren't necessary in the Levy-Macon case because Judge Johnson is granting that relief right away. And in fact, in a highly unusual, though not unprecedented move, Johnson actually orders the United States to appear in the case on his own volition, not just as an amicus curiae or a friend of the court, but as what they call a litigating amicus, meaning it's a friend of the court, it's not a party to the suit, they're not a plaintiff or a defendant, but I mean, for all intents and purposes, they're a plaintiff in this case. The United States, the Department of Justice, specifically the Civil Rights Division, can enter motions for further relief, for contempt of court, not just submitting briefs. So essentially the United States, for the duration of this case, can do everything that the plaintiffs can do, and they will act, in fact, like that. And Johnson knew that. He knew that doing this would give him the resources of the Civil Rights Division. He really respected the attorneys that worked for that division, particularly a man named John Doerr, who many of you may be familiar with, who was the head of that division at the time. That fall, in August of 1963, Johnson orders the Macon County Board of Education to accept initial applications from black students seeking transfer to Macon County's white schools. Now, the majority of the board members at that time had accepted the inevitability of desegregation, of at least token desegregation. That had many others in the community, including the county sheriff, a number of ministerial leaders in the community, were prepared to sort of make this thing work. They were prepared to try to work with elements of the community that were not ready to make this work and try to come to some sort of peaceful consensus. And so the Board of Education at that time is cooperating with the case, and they bring in these applicant students, and along with the Civil Rights Division attorneys, they administer this battery of tests and interviews, and they're trying to whittle that number down to what, as they would have said, and they did say, was a number that the white community could accept as far as transfer at the time. And so Anthony Lee joins 12 others on an acceptance list, and they're all in grades 8 through 12. And they're set to transfer then from all-black Tuskegee Institute High to Tuskegee Public, the formerly all-white institution. And so preparations are made. Preparations are made for the first desegregation of Alabama schools, and the same sort of thing is going on in Birmingham and Huntsville and Mobile. In Tuskegee, though, the Tuskegee Civic Association holds an organizational meeting at the local Black Methodist Church, and the Reverend there, K.L. Buford, speaks, Fred Gray speaks, Detroit Lee gets up and speaks, and they speak to these test case students about sort of what you can expect. You can expect, to be spit on, to be cursed at, but you do not react violently. This is a peaceful movement, and that sort of thing. John Doerr is there. And he pledges the support of the Civil Rights Division. He says, we'll follow the buses every day if we have to, and they in fact do. Meanwhile, across town, the Tuskegee Public Parent Teachers Association is hosting a meeting as well, and they're trying to prepare the white community for this event. And so you have PTA leaders, local clergy, who are resolved to make this thing work peacefully and function properly under the law. Unfortunately, a great number of the 400 or so parents that are at that meeting apparently feel otherwise, and so despite desperate pleas from ministerial leaders like Enos Sellers, from the Sheriff Preston Hornsby, from the local banker Alan Parker, and the chair of Chamber of Commerce, they are instead, many of them, swayed by others who stand up and say, no, we need to contact Governor Wallace. We need to contact Governor George Wallace because he will intervene here. He will help us out. We can defy this thing. And very shrewdly, George Wallace had actually planted a sort of unofficial representative there who also stands up and says, yes, in fact, that's true, and Governor Wallace will do X, Y, and Z, and you need to defy this thing. And many people are swayed by that. Of course, Wallace's strategy here is encourage disorder, use that as an excuse to then close the affected schools, and then that way you do that under the guise of maintaining law and order, but what you've effectively done is prevented desegregation, and of course the ultimate goal there is that Wallace scores political points from that. So what you get then is I suppose lesser known, although equally in my opinion important, if not more important, second stand in the schoolhouse door there in Macon County that fall. On the morning of Monday, September 2, Wallace begins issuing executive orders just as quickly as he possibly can. And this one in particular says, quote, the threat of forced and unwarranted integration of the public schools in this state has created conditions calculated to result in a disruption of the peace and tranquility of this state and to occasion peril to the lives and property of the citizens thereof. He orders the Macon County Board of Education to postpone then the opening of Macon schools, of the Tuskegee Public specifically. He orders the state troopers to surround Tuskegee Public and to prevent the desegregation thereof. And he begins to put pressure not just on the Macon County School Board, he's simultaneously pressuring Birmingham and Huntsville and Mobile as well to delay the opening of schools, to prevent any sort of desegregation. Partly what he's trying to do is create the biggest charade possible and try to get the Kennedy administration to intervene. He wanted a show of force like you had seen at Little Rock. If you read what the Kennedys are saying at the time, they are keenly aware of this. Bobby Kennedy says that Wallace is desperately anxious to force a showdown, and they very much wanted to avoid that, at all cost. So the following week, Wallace begins issuing more and more executive orders. He says, quote, the integration of the public schools, this is ironic, the integration of the public schools will totally disrupt and effectively destroy the educational process and would be an abridgment of the civil rights of other children attending the schools. No student shall be permitted to integrate the public schools of Tuskegee, Birmingham, or Mobile. He had sort of conceded Huntsville at that point. So Anthony Lee and these would-be trailblazers are thus turned away from Tuskegee Public by state troopers. At this point, Judge Johnson does something interesting. He asked all 5 judges in the state who were involved in these school cases to join him in a rare, I have to imagine rare, 5-judge injunction against the governor and the state troopers to enjoin them from any further interference. And he actually drafts this order himself and quite literally signs it himself on behalf of the 5 judges who he had called that day. Wallace proceeds to activate the National Guard. Kennedy federalizes it. There's this sort of completely ridiculous fiasco where Wallace attempts to hide in his office across the street at one point, and you have literally U.S. Marshals in the bushes hiding outside for their part, and it's what one newspaper reporter called a taut game of cat and mouse that goes on at the state capitol as Wallace is avoiding being served with these papers. Well, he comes out in the middle of the night. He's eventually served. And again, the National Guard is federalized, and schools in Tuskegee are desegregated the next day. Actually, I guess the first students to desegregate a K through 12 school are the Armstrong boys in Birmingham, briefly, and then Sonny Hereford's son in Huntsville. But then comes Tuskegee and then Mobile as well that following day. As many of you are, probably all of you are aware, demonstrations in Birmingham, protests in Birmingham then culminated violently in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, the murder of 4 little girls, and then 2 other murders that followed quickly upon that. Hardcore segregationist resistance in Tuskegee was less violent than that, certainly, and certainly less appalling. But it turns out was possibly even more effective. Within 3 days of the arrival of those 13 students, a total white boycott of Tuskegee Public had ensued. Now, it started as a trickle, sort of the most hardcore families pulled their children out, and then it becomes a flood as sort of peer pressure mounts on other families and students, safety concerns mount, uncertainty in general mounts, and then what you get is not just that trickle of the hardcore, that eventually you get this total boycott within a few days. And the majority of the white students then begin attending the other 2 white schools in the county, Shorter and then Macon County High School at Notasulga, or the very newly created one of the first segregationist academies in the state of Alabama, Macon Academy, which was hastily established as many of those academies were. Meanwhile, Tuskegee Public continued to operate as a sort of 13, well, not sort of, but very literally a 13-student school. And Wallace sees that as an opportunity to return to the status quo. As governor, he's ex officio president of the State Board of Education, and those are all his people that sit on that board. And so he can kind of dictate what they do. I wish I could see the minutes of some of these meetings, but invariably when they went to talk about school desegregation, they go into executive session, and there's no record of what they talked about. But I think one could safely say Wallace is pulling the strings here, and he directs the board to direct the Macon board to close that school. So you have the state-directed closure of Tuskegee Public. At that point, Fred Gray later recalled, and I've probably gotten a little bit ahead of myself here, yeah. Fred Gray recalled, the revelation hit him like, quote, the burning bush speaking to Moses. If the governor and the State Board of Education had the authority to close Tuskegee Public and order those black students back to Tuskegee Institute High, then surely they had shown that they had control over the local school systems throughout the state, and couldn't that be used against them? And in fact, it could in the long run. So what you have then is the rationale for this becoming a statewide case. Public school systems in the state of Alabama were supposed to be autonomous, hence those individual NAACP petitions. But there was the state board not only preventing court-ordered desegregation, but doing so in a way which clearly demonstrated that they in fact controlled local boards of education in the state. And this blunder is not lost. An unidentified source in the state government tells the Montgomery Advertiser at one point that state authorities had, quote, made a tactical error. And since the Brown decision, the source said, quote, the theory has been to spread this out as much as possible, to make this a diffuse target, in other words, for litigation. And he says, so that any court action taken is a scattergun action, now, he said, a single shot can do it. And that's precisely the revelation that Fred Gray had, and that's exactly what happens and what becomes of this Levy-Macon case. So what you get then, what this case becomes, is the battleground for a statewide school, the first of its kind, potential statewide school desegregation order. In 1964, Fred Gray files an amended complaint, and he asks the court to add the State Board of Education and the governor and enjoin them from interference. He asked that those 12 students, the number was down to 12 at that point, that they be able to transfer along with the other students to Shorter and Notasulga. And then he dropped the bombshell. He asked the court to order the State Board of Education to desegregate all schools in Alabama that weren't already under some sort of court order. Judge Johnson adds the party's defendant. He orders the Macon board to transfer those 12 students. Fred Gray had arranged to make it sort of 6 and 6 at the two respective schools. But he elects to temporarily shelve this issue of a statewide order for the time being. Well, the State Board of Education then issues a statement which says in part that it, quote, deplores the order of Judge Johnson and pledges every resource at our command to defeat integration and maintain our way of life and high educational standards. Wallace orders the state troopers again to Macon County, and they surround Shorter and Notasulga. There is a showdown, quite literally a showdown there in Notasulga. Al Lingo and the state troopers are there. Sheriff Jim Clark from Dallas County, whose horse-mounted posse had a talent for showing up sort of anytime there was racial trouble afoot. They arrive there at Notasulga. There's an incident where Clark and another policeman board a bus and drag off a young photographer and smash his camera. But sort of more importantly for our purposes, the mayor of Notasulga at that point, James Ray, stands in the doorway, and you get what I've called the vicarious stand. And there's so many stands in the schoolhouse door. There's actually later a Wallace's stand in the school bus door. But this is the vicarious stand in the schoolhouse door. Wallace was not there, but there's the mayor, James Ray, and he's had these two bogus sort of city ordinances passed, and he reads off these ordinances, says, well, I'm the newly elected fire commissioner, and I've determined that the capacity of this school just so happens to be precisely what the current enrollment is, and so this school can't take on any other students, and he turns the bus away. Fred Gray then files yet another amendment to his original complaint in Levy-Macon. The Department of Justice files its own suit against Mayor Ray, and he is effectively enjoined from enforcing those ordinances. At that point, Judge Johnson asked the Fifth Circuit chief, who at the time was Elbert Tuttle, asked him to designate a three-judge court to handle the Levy-Macon case. And I think this gets forgotten a lot. People, because Judge Johnson was the face of this case, because he did, in fact, take on directly the administrative duties of this case for the most part as it was administered as a structural injunction, which we'll talk about. They associate Johnson with this case, but they forget, in fact, that there were two other judges. Tuttle grants him that three-judge court, and it's interesting, the plaintiffs didn't ask for the three-judge court, the defendants didn't ask for it, and it wasn't necessarily called for, and that this wasn't an attack on the pupil placement law, so there's no state statute at issue. Nonetheless, Johnson wants a three-judge court, and so he gets it from Tuttle. You have Richard Reeves on the left, who was at the time with the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, Johnson in the middle there, and then Judge Hobart Grooms was on this three-judge court as well. And so every single decision from this point on that's made in this case is a unanimous decision of this three-judge court. And anytime Johnson saw fit to enter any order, it's going to be discussed thoroughly between these three, and they were unanimous throughout. So that three-judge court orders that the 12 begin attending Shorter and Notasulga, and the exodus begins anew. All the white students leave Shorter and Notasulga. Macon Academy's enrollment doubles to over 325, which maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but in a small county, that makes it, it's been said, the largest high school at that point in the county's history. And the numbers trend up, I think, towards 400, maybe even shortly thereafter. In the months that passed, someone burned down part of Macon County High at Notasulga. The Board of Education is forced to make room for the 6 students there, including Anthony Lee, among the remains, and the 12 finish out their year in pretty much total isolation. Levy-Macon at that point goes to its first of 2 major trials there in 1964. Fred Gray's team, his partner Solomon C., along with attorneys from the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund and attorneys from the Civil Rights Division, they marshaled this mountain of evidence that says not only has the state interfered in Macon County, but the state controls all of these local school districts and ought to be forced to desegregate them. And you get a ruling that summer in which the court enjoins the governor, enjoins the State Board of Education from interference in school desegregation anywhere in the state. And so that is significant. The court determines it's beyond obvious that the state had control of these local school systems, and the state had control over, for example, accounting, textbooks, transportation, school construction, even Bible reading, but their control was, as the court says, most rigidly maintained through finances. The state could allocate teacher units, which then determine how much money the schools got, and they could sort of lord that over them. Having said that, in 64, at that time, the court refrains from issuing a statewide injunction, but it suggests that the time would come where the court could say, you, the state board, have to use your power over the finances of these school systems to force them to desegregate. And so it's a kind of an ominous thing for these school boards and for segregationists. Meanwhile, of course, in 1964, you have the passage of the Civil Rights Act at the national level, and that in addition to what it did with public facilities, it gives unprecedented authority to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to begin affecting school desegregation, because systems all over the South were still fully segregated. HEW then gets tasked with formulating guidelines for school desegregation and then initiating and monitoring compliance with those guidelines. The enforcement mechanism there was the cutoff of federal funding. HEW is able to threaten school systems with a cutoff of federal funding, which then increases actually at the time with the first passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So HEW goes to work in Alabama in 65, seeks the signing of the innocuously named Form 441. And what that is a pledge to submit a desegregation plan based on HEW's guidelines and to begin to implement that. Now, many of these school boards would have been prepared to reluctantly sign, but George Wallace, along with his education chief, the state superintendent, Austin Meadows, initiate a massive interference campaign, and basically a harassment and intimidation campaign. Bear in mind that they're enjoined from interference under the Levy-Macon case. Some officials welcomed Wallace's interference, but many others felt trapped, as one superintendent says, between the devil and the deep. An example of the harassment would be this telegram that Wallace sends, which is also signed, by the way, by the soon-to-be governor and at the time the Speaker of the House, Albert Brewer, to the Lauderdale Board of Education. And to increase the pressure, this telegram, mind you, was released to the local newspaper and to the Associated Press. It says, your statement to the governor's office that you are satisfied with the public school situation in Lauderdale, where more Negro pupils are enrolled in previously all-white schools than there are in either of the large cities of Birmingham or Montgomery, and that you plan to eliminate eventually all Negro schools and transfer those pupils to white schools, could do more to destroy the public education system in Alabama than any action since the infamous Brown decision. We resent and reject this attitude, and we call upon you to align your policies with the minimum requirements of the law and court orders. This harassment intimidation campaign results in predictably, motions for further relief in Levy-Macon, and thus did Levy-Macon come before the three-judge court for another major trial, the biggest trial in its history, in late 1966-67. The 66-67 trial, again, Fred Gray, Solomon C., the Civil Rights Division, the LDF, they produce a mountain of evidence, including depositions of all the state superintendents, that shows how much control the state has. One highlight I'll briefly read to you from the trial. Fred Gray at one point has Austin Meadows, who's being very uncooperative in the witness stand, and he forces him to read a memorandum that Meadows sent to all of the state superintendents, and Meadows calls it, defensively, he calls it an editorial statement on the word segregation, but you might call it a racist parable. He says, quote, segregation is a perfectly good word. It has been practiced through the ages for good results and used by the people of the civilized world for man's greatest advancement. It is the basic principle of culture, the good joined together to segregate themselves from the bad. Segregation is one of the principles of survival throughout the animal kingdom. Animals join their own kind to defend themselves by numbers against other animals that would destroy them. Birds of a feather truly flock together. Wild geese fly across this continent in V formation, but they never join any other flock of birds. The beautiful bluebirds mate with other bluebirds, and so on through bird life. Integration of all human life and all animal life would destroy humanity and would destroy the animal kingdom. Some of you quite rightly chuckle, well, you're not alone, as Fred Gray, eventually Judge Reeves tells Gray to read it because Meadows is being uncooperative. And at that point, the judges you have these stern, decorous judges like Frank Johnson, the most stern man you could ever imagine, and they're all struggling to contain their own laughter at that point in the trial. No one, I don't think, was laughing, though, in March when this opinion and decree comes down. This is one of the most important school desegregations rendered in the post-Brown era. The court orders the state superintendent, who by that point Meadows is out and Ernest Stone is in, orders him to ensure that all of the systems not already under court order, that would be 99 at that time, that they adopt a court-mandated model desegregation plan, and it's the first order of its kind. It is what they call a statewide structural injunction with a remedial decree. So the court retained jurisdiction, and it would then oversee the implementation of this injunction and the implementation of these desegregation plans. That essentially puts the court in charge of restructuring Alabama's educational system. So there are big implications for federalism here. That model plan included provisions for transportation, for extracurricular activities, for facilities, for faculty desegregation, and of course, pupil desegregation, which at the time included freedom of choice, meaning students could choose to transfer to a school initially provided for the opposite race. The key here is that this doesn't just remove discrimination, it doesn't just prevent discrimination from occurring. The aim, and this is what they mean when they say a remedial decree, is to eliminate the past effects of decades of discrimination. So Johnson takes charge of administering this, ensuring that Stone, the superintendent, was doing all that was required, which for the most part he in fact does. Months and years of negotiations follow with local officials over specifics in every single location. Johnson has what they call school board Saturdays in his chambers, where they meet with local officials alongside Fred Gray or Saul C. or the LDF or the Civil Rights Division, and they hammer out just exactly what every single one of these local plans would look like. The significance here is multiple. First of all, this becomes the model approach for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in seeking statewide remedial decrees in other states. It becomes the model for other kinds of structural injunctions in Alabama. Prisons, mental health facilities, you may be familiar with the Wyatt v. Stinkney case, the Pugh v. Locke or James v. Wallace cases dealing with those two situations. It becomes the inspiration for Alabama's landmark voting rights case, Dillard versus Crenshaw County. Most significantly, in the immediate sense, it eliminated the need for 99 separate lawsuits and 99 separate sets of plaintiffs. The Christian Science Monitor calls Lee the most sweeping implementation of the Supreme Court's 1954 school desegregation ruling yet rendered. Owen Fiss, a legal scholar, says he saw in Johnson's handling the case something as ingenious and path-breaking as Marbury versus Madison. And Fred Gray in the 1990s estimated that probably over 300 opinions had been written on various aspects of the case. Now, as I've only got a few minutes probably left here, I just want to discuss the different phases that the case goes through at that point. At that time, you're talking about freedom of choice, but almost the very next year, the Supreme Court sort of throws freedom of choice out if it's not eliminating racially identifiable schools. When it hands down Green versus New Kent County, basically the Supreme Court says the point here was to eliminate black schools and white schools and to have just schools. And that wasn't happening with freedom of choice. There was a lot of foot dragging and resistance. And so what the court says, if freedom of choice doesn't do it, you've got to do something else. And what this leads to is an era in the late 60s and early 70s of compulsory assignment, of assigning students to schools to eliminate that racial identifiability regardless of where those students choose to go. And this causes, as you might guess, a significant backlash. There's a lot of outrage directed particularly at Frank Johnson because he had become the face of the case. All kinds of hate mail in his files, death threats and the like. One man at one point in Butler County, the editor of the Greenville Advocate, actually responds by damning Johnson to hell. That editorial had been sent to Johnson by another young Greenville man who wrote in this letter that you see here, "It is my sincere hope that you will spend an eternity in hell for the strife and misery you have caused the people of Alabama, for playing God with other people's lives." And in closing, he wrote, "I hope that you will realize the extent to which you are despised in this state, and if this realization disturbed your sleep in the least, then this letter will have served a purpose." This is only one of many letters Johnson received. It's not just segregationist whites who complain. There are a lot of blacks who are disappointed that this results in the elimination of formerly all-black schools, which communities took a great deal of pride in. It results in the demotion of those schools. All-black high schools became middle schools or elementary schools as a part of some of these plans. Also, when they end up in formerly all-white schools, they encounter racist textbooks. They encounter former symbols of the Confederacy that are distasteful to them, whether it be the singing of Dixie by a marching band or a Confederate flag or something else. So there's a lot of protest across the board. Nonetheless, by 1970, there's substantial change across the state. Substantial changes in every system. By 1971, each Lee system had a plan in place for eliminating dual school systems, And as soon as they adopted or began to adopt those plans and the plans were approved by the court and signed, those cases were then set apart. They were split off from the main Levy-Macon litigation and assigned to a single judge in a district that would then monitor their progress in actually implementing that plan and achieving what they call a unitary status. And that carries on for decades. There are systems that don't get that status until the new millennium. As I understand it, there are a few, at least, of those systems that have still not done that to this very day and are still under direct court supervision. At this point, the Segregationist Academy movement really begins to take off. In 1965, there are 34 private schools in the state which could be identified as such. By 1970, 109. By 1975, 134. Now, not all of these survived, of course, but a great many of them, in fact, most of them did. Some of them struggle to stay afloat today while others thrive. Some of them are doing quite well. That's Hooper Academy not far from here, and that's Lee Scott Academy, a sort of combined Segregationist Academy in Opelika, Alabama. Now, I don't have much time, but I do just want to briefly say there are other phases of this case that are sometimes forgotten. In 1968, the plaintiffs motioned to have the state's athletic systems added as part. There was a white and a black athletic organization, and the plaintiffs motioned to have them added. The court orders them to formulate a plan for merger, which you see on the far right there, and which they do, and that's submitted and finalized in May of '68. There's a faculty desegregation phase here, where in 1969, the ASTA, the Alabama State Teachers Association, which by then had been desegregated, petitions for further relief to protect black teachers and administrators. When these plans were put in place, a lot of times they're unfairly demoted or let go, and so to protect them, they acquire the help of Solomon C., who is Fred Gray's partner, and he represents the ASTA in that phase of the litigation, and those are incorporated into the terminal type, as they call them, plans. You also, one of the final stages that you see is the desegregation of the state's trade schools and junior colleges, which is also a part of this case. In April of 1969, the plaintiffs motioned for further relief, asking the court to order the desegregation of these schools, and it actually orders HEW to formulate that plan, Health, Education, and Welfare Department, and they do. In August of 1970, the court approves the HEW plan, which calls for the elimination of de facto dual attendance zones by race, separate transportation zones by race, racial identifiability through faculty segregation, the elimination of duplicate programs at geographically proximate schools in a couple of different cases. And so after some modifications, this phase comes to an end in 1972, and the three-judge court at that point is dissolved. The sort of final phase of this is one that really gets lost, I think, is the sort of splinter system phase. There was actually this Calhoun to its own single judge, and it's being monitored. At that point, the city of Oxford, which is a sort of, you might call it a suburb of Anniston, I guess it's not really a sister city, but it breaks away and forms its own separate city school system. This had been happening in the Birmingham area, Vestavia Hills, Pleasant Grove. Other systems were breaking away, and I think part, if not all of the point, was to get themselves out from under that desegregation order. The plaintiffs in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department are keenly aware of that, and they asked the court in this case to bring Oxford under the Calhoun County order. Judge Frank McFadden agrees, as does the Fifth Circuit, which holds, quote, cities cannot secede from the county where the effect, to say nothing of the purpose of the secession, has a substantial adverse effect on the desegregation of the county school district. If this were legally permissible, there could be incorporated towns for every white neighborhood in every city. So it brings these, it allows for these quote-unquote splinter systems to be brought under these orders. This has enormous impact on the Jefferson County case. And so those systems are forced to adhere to certain provisions of that desegregation order as well. The Supreme Court cites this part of the case in a couple of very important cases of its own. And that's the sort of last phase, unless you consider that this continues with those cases that are assigned to single judges. So what about the legacy then of this as a statewide case? In part, I think it's what I talk about to a large extent in my dissertation, and that's what I call the rearticulation of resistance, what I'm sort of piggybacking on a historian by the name of Joseph Crispino who deals with Mississippi. George Wallace is a guy who always touted his ultra-segregationist credentials and his defiance. His defiance is what won him a lot of votes. He, of course, his wife Lurleen serves as his sort of regent for a term, and then Brewer is in office, and then Wallace returns. By the time he returns, Wallace really is more like Albert Brewer than the old Wallace. Resistance by that point had to be smart. it had to tailor itself to the demands of the law, and that's the sort of point here. Public pronouncements had to be few, charades reduced to nil, and language had to be race neutral. And so what you see in part is Wallace and others working with the legislature to devise those kinds of plans, part of which it was a plan to shield the money of white landowners from allocation to the education of black school children in the increasingly all-black public school systems of the Black Belt. These efforts produced the so-called lid bills to the Alabama Constitution, which classified property by current usage and capped the rate at which it could be taxed. These provisions were challenged in the Lynch versus Alabama case, which probably some of you know recently went before the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta, and that appeal was shot down in January. And so those efforts to attack the lid bill were unsuccessful, but the struggle therefore continues. So in conclusion, I guess, despite pretty substantial white flight, now in places this white flight has somewhat of a reverse effect where people come back to the public school systems after initial jolt, but in metropolitan areas like Birmingham and in the Black Belt, it is quite significant to these segregationist academies or to metropolitan independent school systems. Despite that, though, we can't lose sight of the fact that Levy-Macon created and maintains in a lot of places like where I went to school in Opelika, mass interracial contact in schools, and a lot of scholars believe that's what's going to carry us forward into perhaps a better time, or to make this, as Frank Johnson said, a meaningful reality for people. And Saul C. said the same. He tells a story in his book, and he told it to me as well in a somewhat different form, where he's before a federal judge, as he often found himself, and the judge says, Judge Hand says, "Now, see, do you ever think we'll find a time in this country where race doesn't matter?" And he said he knew immediately what his answer would be, and yet he's trying to kind of blunt the effect by pretending to be introspective about it. And he says, "Well, no, Judge, I don't." And Judge is taken aback. He says, "Well, why do you think that, C?" And he says, "Well, Judge, I think maybe because I've been white too long and you've been black too long." And the judge, there's a sort of gasp in the courtroom in a tense moment. And then C, as he's recounting this to me, he says, if ever is going to happen, it's going to be because these kids in these schools learn to deal with each other on an equal basis. And he says to me, "You and I can't do it." And I think he's right. So thank you all very much for being attentive and for coming today. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Sherry. Thanks a lot.
We have time for some questions. If you have a question, raise your hand, and Shaylin or I will see that you get a microphone to speak into, and we can take a few questions now.
Okay. I hope I can answer some of them.
Yes,
Yes,
first part of your presentation, you seem to accept Huntsville from the troubles that Lee and Mobile and Montgomery and Jefferson County had with the schools. Were there less blacks up there? Were the relations better? Or Dr. Brown wouldn't stand for it? Or what was the deal?
Well, all of the above. So first of all, Huntsville, I shouldn't have suggested, was exempt from strife. There's a state trooper cordon there. You have people trying to break through that cordon. People are yelling and screaming at the state troopers about this. And so there was strife there, to be sure. They were exempted, though, from the sort of full-on Wallace onslaught of pressure, and I think that's because you did have the kind of movement that you saw in Tuskegee to get people to work with this thing just happened to be a little bit stronger in Huntsville, and just by numbers, I mean. They didn't have as many of the sort of staunch, hardcore, unbudging segregationists as you had down there in the Black Belt in Huntsville, and you had a lot of people. With the as you mentioned, Dr. Von Braun, with the arsenal there and the Space Center from other parts of the country and the world, who were not necessarily so dedicated to that. And so having said that, in the long run, it doesn't. They have just as much. They have just as many problems in Huntsville in the long run, I think, too, as a lot of other places, and even now. Having said that, they were at least exempted from. Wallace kind of conceded, I think I said at one point, Huntsville, because the sort of moderate movement there was strong enough to kind of resist his advances. He figures, well, I've got a better chance where I've got more control, basically. And he knew he could bring the pressure to bear on Albert Boutwell in Birmingham and on, where he close to home in Tuskegee, and then down there in Mobile as well.
There's one in the back.
Yeah.
Just a moment.
Okay.
I just wonder, since I lived in Huntsville and in Birmingham all this time and was raising school children, and now I'm in Prattville. How would you, as a historian, suggest that Montgomery reintegrate its schools, since we're seeing such a huge white flight into Prattville and increasingly segregation of the Montgomery schools?
Did you say, how would I suggest that they reintegrate them? Wow. We as historians, we do a real good job of Captain Hindsight, and when we're tasked with providing prescriptions for future solutions, it's a lot more difficult for us to do. That's a really good question, and it's really hard because they've kind of, I think, I don't want to say tried everything, but you've seen magnet schools. What you kind of saw suggested by that ruling in the Calhoun County case held kind of, I think, a lot of promise. And even though Prattville is a different county, that would be a different case. And Montgomery County was a sort of combined city-county system, just like Mobile was. But there were efforts, of course, and this obviously, as many of you know, becomes a national issue in the 70s. It wasn't just a Southern issue, and finally they realized that, and you saw massive backlash in places from Boston to Los Angeles. But really, any further efforts to get any kind of metropolitan-wide effective school desegregation plan are hampered by a couple of decisions of the Supreme Court in the Detroit case, and then in a case in San Antonio where they say you can't equalize funding even between metropolitan area school districts. So it's a very difficult thing, and I don't readily have the answers. Now that white flight has gotten to the extent that it has, I'm kind of overwhelmed by that question. I think, though, that a good starting point is to have a firm understanding of how we got to the point that where we're at, and that's kind of what we try to do. It's we're sort of the ambassadors that give these reports to the policymakers, and if we were policymakers, I would have all the answers, and I'm not sure that I do.
And in the back.
I'm really following up on, I think, her question. The Atlantic had an article just last month, and NPR was doing a program on Tuscaloosa and how it has become more segregated than it was in the 70s and 80s, and a lot of African Americans felt that was such a good time in that there was that give and take between the races in the 70s and 80s, and now it's gone back to segregation again, or at least a big part of it. And I guess my question is the same as hers. What do we do? How do you have the same goals?
Well, I think you kind of suggested. I'm not on the ground here in Montgomery. I am in Atlanta, where they have many of these same problems and more. But I'm reminded of somebody with the Alabama Council on Human Relations and what they said when that's a liberal organization that tried to make some of these solutions work at the time. And he said, what we were trying to do is make people realize that you could sit down at the same table for somebody of the opposite race, for God's sake, and with no obvious immediate ill effects. And so it sounds maybe cliche, but I think one of the things that began to work at this time were biracial organizations. That were created for that specific purpose, community action organizations. Now, having said that, in a place like Montgomery or Tuscaloosa, which you have residential white flight accompanying, it's not just white flight from schools, but significant residential white flight, that's a problem. Although you do see some promise, even though there are all sorts of problems with whether you call it gentrification or urban renewal or whatever, I think, and especially in Atlanta, it is promising that younger generations are moving back into the cities. Now, of course, that again carries problems of displacement for those that are there. But I think, given that, and given some time, if that younger generation, and I think about, for example, my advisor is involved in this sort of thing, working with the community that's been there for a few decades as part of a younger generation that's moving back in, that doesn't have the sort of baggage of the generation that's just left or that's been leaving over the previous few decades. I think you could see some meaningful biracial cooperation there. Having said that, what many, and including my advisor, think that the solution may well be is charter schools. Now, I know in Alabama here you have your own battle with that with the state legislature, and I've kind of kept up with that somewhat. But in Atlanta, that seems to be the thrust. A lot of people have sort of put all of their cards and all of their hope into the charter school movement, and to sort of get it out of the hands of as much as possible of the bureaucracy and the school boards. I don't know. We'll see. The book is just opening, in fact, on that in Atlanta, and it remains to be seen whether that could come to fruition here at all. As you well know, here in Alabama, there's a significant push against that for a variety of reasons. But I think those are a couple of possible solutions. But it does, frankly, look kind of grim in places like Tuscaloosa and here in
And
Montgomery.
there's another question in the back.
Yes.
Yes, in your research, did you discover, and if so, can you expound on Wallace's leadership in establishing the white academies?
Yes, absolutely, and it begins with Macon Academy. There's actually a pile of records here, in Wallace's records here at the archives, which is devoted to correspondence with the founders of Macon Academy, and also what Wallace had done, and what you'd actually seen John Patterson do is like go to Virginia, and then they're sort of the vanguard of all of these different segregationist solutions. And so Wallace was in contact with one of the first segregation academies there in Prince Edward, and he carries that information then and offers it really and openly to anyone who would listen. And so he's very much involved in Macon Academy, and not just that, but two others in Birmingham that are not long-lasting. William Hoover's of City of Hoover, initially was a founding member of that chapter of the National States Rights Party up there, and he has a Seg Academy there for a while. There's one in West End before the exodus there, and Wallace is very much involved in that. He actually at one point even is so involved that he actually collects donations from state employees and then distributes that to these fledgling segregationist academies. Now, once the sort of movement had taken off, and again, the post-Brewer Wallace has to be a lot more careful about that, but the movement had sort of taken on enough steam at that point that Wallace didn't have to be as involved as he was. Of course, you already had Montgomery Academy in existence by the time Macon Academy comes into existence, and so Wallace is you see his people like Hugh Maddox facilitating coordination and cooperation between the Montgomery Academy folks and the Macon Academy folks. So to answer your question directly, he is directly and absolutely involved in that.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. We're almost out of time, but we have one more question right here.
Okay.
Mine was more of a question than it was a comment. I think I integrated Goodwin Junior High School back in 1968. The issues then were race. Issues of segregation in Montgomery now are really more sociocultural apartheid and issues associated with poverty. I think it's a class issue as opposed to a race issue.
I think that's a prescient point, and that's something that we've got to deal with. And that's where, we try to teach our students, there'd been a trend for so long to teach the civil rights movement as the 60s or as the late 50s and 60s. And where you saw that movement going, and maybe most obviously with Dr. King before his assassination, and becoming a movement that was about socioeconomic issues and not necessarily tied to race. And so maybe that gives us some more hope if, again, dealing, whether it be charter schools, biracial organizations committed to this sort of thing, or whether working for and non-divisive urban renewal or gentrification or whatever you want to call it. It has to be sort of incorporate all of those things, I would guess.
Dr. Bagley will be here for a few minutes if you have more questions or comments
Thank you
or
all
would
very
like
much.
to speak with
I
him.
appreciate it.
Thank you for coming.